Be very careful not to make these yarn substitution mistakes when you're swapping out a yarn in a pattern. Follow on to find out some of the key points you need to make sure that you match when you're trying to take the yarn that is in a pattern and match it with something from your stash or from your local yarn shop. Let's take a look at what you need to check out. So if you're newer to knitting, and I remember running into this problem when I was trying to find a yarn that would match my pattern, the first thing I looked at is I'd pick up the yarn in the pattern, take a look at where the yarn was listed, and what I went straight to was the name of the yarn. So did it call it out as a DK or a double knitting, sport, fingering, maybe it was an Aran or a worsted. So that's where I went, and then I'd go into my local yarn shop, and the shop didn't have a lot of people working there that were yarn knowledgeable. So I just kind of poked around myself and found a yarn that had the same name. So in this particular case, it was a child's beanie I was knitting, and it just said a DK. And I went in and I did match the same type of fiber. So it was cotton, and I went in to find something that was cotton. I'm like, oh, this says DK. So I went with that. And I very quickly discovered that yarn names don't mean very much. The name of the yarn, all that tells you is what the yarn company gives it the ballpark of being in. So for instance, a DK in the book I was looking at, they were actually using it was about, I think it was 20 stitches per 4 inches. So it really was, if it was a US yarn, it would be more of a worsted. Whereas the one I had was more like 23, 24 stitches per 4 inches. So a much finer yarn. And I had no idea that there was those kind of range. I thought a name was a name. So that is rule number 1. Do not be fooled by the name that it says on the band, because sometimes a yarn company needs to fit it into a particular category, but it's not really truly in that. And those categories have really wide ranges. So that can be a very, very rough guide, but then you need to dig down. So the next thing that probably would have been a little bit more useful is taking a look at the suggested gauge. So kind of taking a look at what needle size do they suggest using and what's the expected gauge for that yarn with that. So hopefully you want to have those somewhat similar, particularly if the pattern is knit, for instance, with a fairly even stitch count. So it's not, this would be fairly standard gauge. It's not knit loosely. So that's kind of, you need to be careful with that the pattern gauge is kind of the expected one. And also what the pattern stitches, because if the pattern is mainly in lace or cables or whatever it might be, and they don't give the stockinette stitch gauge, then you can't really compare, because on a ball band, it's the stockinette stitch gauge that they're giving you. So that's kind of the next thing that will give you just a general idea of what you might be able to, what you're going to be looking at. So that's starting with very broad terms. The next things where if you want to drill more into it and have a more accurate or a more reliable substitution, the next things you're going to want to look at is, first of all, how is it spun? This is a big one for me, and you can refer back to one of my previous videos where I talk about the 2 standard ways of spinning, which would be woolen spun versus worsted spun. If it's woolen spun, it traps a lot of air in the fiber, and so that means you actually get a lot more yardage for the same weight yarn. So it's going to be a little deceptive. So if you start by picking the same type of spinning that is going to be in that fiber. So there's on Ravelry and some other websites that you can actually see there's a yarn substitution website which will actually let you know how it's spun on that. So that's a really good one to know. We're just pausing the video for a second to remind you that if you're enjoying the video, give us a thumbs up down below, because that way we know which videos you're liking and we'll make sure that we make more of them. So back to the video now. Next one is, what kind of fiber is it? So if possible, stick with the same kind of fiber mix or same ballpark. So if it's wool and it's superwash and worsted spun, so very smooth, very heavy, find something that falls into that category, and then the finished fabric is going to look as close as possible. If it's something woolly like this and woolen spun and also a wool, then try and stick with that. If you've got something where maybe the fiber is a mix between like a silk and a wool, then the silk is going to give a little bit more weight though it might be a bit too costly for you, because silk can be a little bit, you know, on the more expensive side. So maybe try and find something that's more of a superwash yarn. Wool yarn is also going to give you just a little bit more weight and silkiness to it. So it's going to look kind of similar, have that same weightiness to it. So that will be the next thing. Kind of try to get close, either close to the type of fiber you've got, or then, you know, tied with that, kind of take a look at if you've got a match that can be as close as possible. So once those are kind of close, you can then also compare the ball bands. So I've got a couple of ones up here. I'd taken ones here, they were a little bit different, but they would both be kind of a worsted weight. So this is Juliette and this is Kremke Baby Sole. So for this one, it is a mix between woolen and worsted spun. So it's got a bit of air in it, but it's still a little bit more dense than a lot of woolen spun. And you need to know how much. There's 100 grams in here and there's 250 meters. So that's actually fairly good yardage. But because there's air in this, it actually will knit to a slightly looser stitch. So the needle size is 4 to 5 millimeter. And I actually do find it's quite happy being knit at 5 millimeter. So, which is surprising for the amount of yardage, but that would be because it's woolen spun, so it goes a little bit further because of all of the air in there. This one is a Kremke Sole Baby Alpaca, and it's 100% alpaca, and it would also be listed as a worsted spun, but when you take a look at it, it feels lighter than this, and the indication is kind of a little different, because there's 50 grams, but there's only 100 meters in that 50 grams. So in 100 grams, there would be 200 meters versus the 250 meters in this. Similar yarns, but really, really different yardage. So just to give you an idea how the different types of fiber and the different ways it's spun can quite dramatically impact how the actual fiber, how the actual length is going to be. But like the stitch count, let me see, it's 4 to 5 millimeters needles that they suggest, and it's about 20 stitches per 4 inches is what they're saying you should get here. I'm having a look here. So this one is much wider. This one is suggesting 19 to 17 stitches per 4 inches. So even though there's much more yardage, that will be explained by the actual spinning process. And a little bit that this yarn is a little bit lighter because it's wool versus alpaca. The alpaca probably has a little bit more density to it, and it's a denser spin. So it makes it very, I find that the yardage is a very, very rough guide, that you need to take that, the fiber that it's spun with, and the actual, the suggested size, so that you get a feel for how it behaves when it's being knit up. But what I would ultimately suggest you try to do, if at all possible, is gather a range of a couple of different yarns that you quite like in weights that you regularly use. So for me, I tend to knit a lot with double knitting, sports weight, knit a bit into the light worsted. So I tend to gather a lot of those different yarns. And that allows you to swatch, because that's ultimately going to let you know if the fabric is going to behave the way you want it to, and if you can comfortably get the gauge that you're working with. So that's really what you should try to do, is get hold of, rather than getting the whole project yarn, just get a single skein, swatch it up and see if it comfortably matches the pattern gauge or gets close, and that you like the actual yarn. So there's a lot to think about when you're substituting, but swatching ultimately is going to give you the final answer. So don't miss that step.